The dust of the Arizona Territory billowed in angry crimson clouds behind the departing wagon train, obscuring the lone figure slumped against a wizened mesquite tree. Josephine Keller clutched her burning chest, watching through fever-glazed eyes as her last chance at California glory disappeared into the merciless horizon. The wagon master had been clear. They couldn't risk typhoid spreading through their company. One life wasn't worth dozens. So they left her behind in Gila Bend with nothing but a canteen, 3 days' provisions, and hollow promises to send help. "They'll come back," she whispered to herself, though the desert wind swept away her words as easily as it had her hopes. She'd sold everything to join that train west: her father's silver pocket watch, her mother's china, even the deed to the small Kentucky farm she'd inherited. Now, at 22 years old, Josephine had nothing but the clothes on her back and a fever that threatened to cook her alive from the inside. The scorching sun beat down upon the ramshackle collection of buildings that made up Gila Bend. In 1872, this was hardly more than a dusty way station, a reluctant pause in most travelers' journeys west. Josephine's vision swam as she tried to focus on the faded sign of the general store across the street. Her legs wouldn't respond when she tried to stand. The world tilted sideways, and she surrendered to the darkness that had been creeping around the edges of her consciousness. When she awoke, the quality of light had changed. Golden sunset rays filtered through unfamiliar windows. She lay on a bed, not the hard, packed earth where she'd collapsed. The room was small but tidy, with rough-hewn walls and simple furnishings. "Back among the living, I see." The voice startled her. A man sat in a chair by the window, whittling away at a small piece of wood. He was tall and lean, with sun-bronzed skin that spoke of years under the harsh desert sun. His light brown hair fell just past his collar, and a neatly trimmed beard framed his square jaw. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, clear blue like a mountain lake, regarding her with careful assessment. "Where?" Her voice cracked, her throat painfully dry. "My place. Just behind the livery." He set down his whittling and poured water from a pitcher into a tin cup. "Name's Jake Harrington. Found you half dead in the street." He approached and helped her sit up enough to drink. The water was the sweetest thing Josephine had ever tasted. "They left me," she said after draining the cup, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. Jake nodded, his expression grim. "The Sanderson train. I saw them pull out this morning." He refilled her cup. "Reckon they thought they were doing what was best for the group. I paid for passage to Sacramento." Her voice sounded small even to her own ears. "Everything I had." Typhoid doesn't much care about financial arrangements. He placed a cool cloth on her forehead. "Doc Jenkins looked you over while you were out. Says it's not typhoid, just a nasty influenza. Still, those folks weren't taking chances." Josephine closed her eyes, fighting back tears. "Not typhoid. They'd abandoned her for nothing. Why did you help me? You could have caught whatever I have." A smile ghosted across his face. "Had the fever last year. Figured I'm probably safe." He shrugged, a gesture that seemed both casual and self-conscious. "Besides, couldn't just leave you there. Everyone else did." The bitterness in her voice surprised even her. "I'm not everyone else." He returned to his chair. "Rest now. We'll figure out what's next when you're stronger." The days blurred together in a haze of fever and fitful sleep. Jake brought broth and water, changed cool compresses, and spooned medicine that tasted like boiled tree bark between her cracked lips. In her more lucid moments, she learned that he ran the livery stable and did odd jobs around town. He'd come west after the war, trying to outrun memories of battles he wouldn't name. He spoke little of his past beyond that, deflecting questions with gentle humor. A week passed before Josephine could sit up without assistance. Another 3 days before she could walk the short distance across the room without her legs threatening to buckle. All the while, Jake watched over her with patient vigilance, sleeping in the chair while she occupied his bed. "Why don't you have a wife to help with all this nursing?" she asked one evening as he changed the linens on the bed, his hands stilled briefly. "Had someone once. She didn't much care for the frontier life. Went back east 5 years ago. I'm sorry." He shook his head. "Don't be. Some folks aren't built for this country. Takes a special kind to weather what the territory throws at you. And you think I'm not that kind?" She couldn't keep the challenge from her voice. His blue eyes met hers, steady and appraising. "Madam, you survived a week of fever that would have killed most. I reckon you've got more grit than half the men in this town." The compliment warmed her more than it should have. As days turned to weeks, Josephine regained her strength. Jake moved a cot into the small sitting room for himself, insisting she continue using his bed until she was fully recovered. He brought her books from the small lending library in town, taught her to play poker with a worn deck of cards, and told stories of the colorful characters who passed through Gila Bend. One morning in late May, nearly 3 weeks after the wagon train had abandoned her, Josephine stepped outside the small cabin behind the livery. The desert air was still cool, the sun just beginning to peek over the eastern mountains. Jake stood by the corral, brushing down a dappled gray mare. "She's beautiful," Josephine said, approaching slowly. Jake nodded without looking up. "This is Stormy, gentlest horse I've ever trained." He ran a hand along the mare's neck. "Thought you might like to start riding once you're fully mended, get your strength back." "I've never ridden anything fancier than a plow horse." "Then it's high time you learned." He finally turned to face her, and something in his expression shifted. It was the first time he'd seen her in proper daylight, standing upright, her hair washed and braided, wearing a clean dress he'd purchased from the general store. "You look better." "I feel better." She hesitated. "Jake, I need to talk to you about what happens next." His shoulders tensed slightly. "What did you have in mind?" "I need to find work. I can't keep living off your charity." Relief visibly washed over him. "Thought you were fixing to leave." The idea hadn't even occurred to her. Where would she go? How would she get there? More importantly, why did the thought of leaving cause an unexpected ache in her chest? "I don't have anywhere to go," she admitted, "but I can't keep being a burden." "You're no burden, Josephine." He said her name carefully like it was something precious. "But if you're set on working, Mrs. Abernathy at the hotel needs help with the laundry and cleaning. I already spoke to her." "You did?" He shrugged, suddenly intensely interested in a knot in Stormy's mane. "Figured you'd be wanting to stand on your own 2 feet sooner or later." "It's not much, but it comes with a room at the back of the hotel." Josephine wasn't sure if she felt grateful or dismissed. "When does she want me to start?" "Whenever you're ready." He finally looked up. "No rush. You're welcome here as long as you need." The words should have comforted her. Instead, they left her with an odd emptiness. She'd grown accustomed to Jake's quiet presence, his dry humor, the way he hummed old spirituals when he thought she was asleep. The prospect of moving to the hotel, even just across town, felt strangely like another abandonment. 2 days later, Josephine started work at the Desert Rose Hotel. The labor was hard, the hours long, but Mrs. Abernathy was fair and the pay decent. Her room was small but private, with a narrow window that looked out onto the main street. Each evening, exhausted from hauling water and scrubbing linens, she would sit by that window and watch the comings and goings of the town. Often, she would see Jake leading horses to water or delivering repaired tack to the various businesses. Sometimes he would glance up at her window, raise his hat in greeting. Those brief moments became the highlights of her days. A month into her employment, Josephine was folding fresh linens when Mrs. Abernathy appeared in the doorway of the laundry room. "Mr. Harrington is asking for you out front," the older woman said, a knowing smile playing at her lips. "Says he needs your assistance with something urgent." Josephine's heart stuttered. She smoothed her apron and patted her hair before catching herself. "Did he say what it was about?" "No, but he's got Stormy with him, all saddled up." Outside, Jake stood holding the reins to the dappled mare and a sturdy buckskin gelding. He wore clean clothes, not his usual work attire, and had trimmed his beard. "Mrs. Abernathy said you needed help with something," Josephine asked, suddenly self-conscious of her work dress and the wisps of hair escaping her bun. "I do." He handed her Stormy's reins. "I need someone to help me eat this picnic I packed. Seems a shame to let it go to waste." Josephine blinked in surprise. "A picnic? Sunday's your day off, isn't it?" His confidence seemed to waver slightly at her hesitation. "Thought you might like to see a bit more of the territory than just the inside of that laundry room." The invitation warmed her from head to toe. "I'd like that very much. But I'm hardly dressed for riding. Mrs. Abernathy said she'd give you an hour to change." He smiled, a full, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "If you want to go, that is." "I do." The words came out more breathless than she intended. "Give me a few minutes." She changed into her one good dress, a simple blue cotton that Jake had purchased for her during her convalescence. It wasn't designed for riding, but it would have to do. Mrs. Abernathy helped her pin her hair more securely and gave her a wide-brimmed hat. "Don't you worry about coming back early," the older woman said with a wink. "That man's been walking around like a lovesick calf for weeks now. About time he worked up the courage to court you proper." Josephine felt her face flush. "He's just being kind. He feels responsible for me since he found me." Mrs. Abernathy gave her a look that said she wasn't fooling anyone. "Responsibility don't make a man trim his beard and shine his boots, girl. Now go on before he changes his mind." Jake's eyes widened appreciatively when she emerged from the hotel. "You look nice," he said, then winced as if regretting the inadequacy of the compliment. "I mean beautiful. You look beautiful, Josephine." It was the first time anyone had called her beautiful since she'd left Kentucky. "Thank you." She gestured to Stormy. "I hope I remember what you taught me about mounting. Here." He moved closer, linking his fingers together to form a step for her foot. The casual touch of his hands at her waist as he helped her into the saddle sent warmth spreading through her body. They rode at an easy pace, leaving the dusty buildings of Gila Bend behind. Jake led them along a narrow trail that followed a seasonal wash, eventually opening into a small canyon where cottonwood trees clustered around a spring-fed pool. "It's lovely," Josephine breathed as they dismounted in the dappled shade. The water bubbled up clear and sweet, creating a lush oasis in the middle of the desert. Wildflowers dotted the grassy area around the spring. "Found it my first year here." Jake spread a blanket beneath the largest cottonwood. "Don't share it with many people." "I'm honored to be among the select few." She settled on the blanket while he unpacked the saddlebags: cold chicken, corn bread, apples, and a jar of honey. It was a feast compared to her usual meals at the hotel. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the gentle burble of the spring and the whisper of leaves overhead. Josephine found herself studying Jake's profile, the strong line of his jaw beneath his neatly trimmed beard, the laugh lines at the corners of his eyes, the slight bump on the bridge of his nose that suggested it had been broken once. "You're staring," he said without looking at her. "I'm wondering about why you've been so kind to me." She plucked a blade of grass, twisting it between her fingers. "You had no obligation to help me that day, and certainly no obligation to keep helping me after." He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. Finally, he sighed. "During the war, I got separated from my regiment after Shiloh, took a bullet in the shoulder, fever set in." His eyes grew distant with memory. "A farm family found me. They could have turned me in. We were in Confederate territory by then, but instead they hid me in their barn, nursed me back to health, never even knew their names. So this is repaying a debt." She tried to keep the disappointment from her voice. "No." His eyes locked with hers, suddenly intense. "This is remembering what it feels like to be alone and afraid, and choosing not to walk past." He reached for her hand, hesitant, giving her every chance to pull away. "But the truth is, Josephine, I stopped thinking about duty or obligation weeks ago." Her heart pounded as his calloused fingers entwined with hers. "What do you think about now? How the room feels empty when you're not in it." His voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. "How I look for reasons to walk past the hotel, hoping to catch a glimpse of you. How I've never met anyone as strong or determined as you." Josephine's breath caught in her throat. "I think about you too, more than I should." "Why shouldn't you?" The question was gentle, genuinely curious. "Because I have nothing, Jake. No money, no family, no prospects. I'm not the kind of woman a man builds a future with." He shook his head, a small smile playing at his lips. "See, that's where you're wrong. You're exactly the kind of woman a man builds a future with out here. Someone who doesn't break when life gets hard. Someone who stands up after being knocked down." His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "If you'll let me, I'd like to court you properly, Josephine Keller." The words sent a jolt of happiness through her so intense it was almost painful. "I'd like that very much." His smile widened, relief and joy mingling in his expression. Then, with gentle deliberation, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was brief, chaste, but it sealed something between them, a promise, a beginning. The summer months passed in a haze of sweetness and discovery. Jake courted Josephine with a quiet determination that spoke more of his feelings than grand gestures ever could. Every Sunday, her day off, they would ride out to different spots around Gila Bend, sometimes back to their special spring, other times to rocky outcroppings with views that stretched for miles. He taught her to ride properly, to shoot a revolver, to recognize the signs of approaching storms in the desert sky. She taught him to dance in the privacy of the livery after hours, humming the waltzes she remembered from her Kentucky youth. By September, the whole town knew they were courting. Mrs. Abernathy watched their courtship with grandmotherly approval, often forgetting to assign Josephine evening chores so she could spend time with Jake. Mr. Jenkins, the town's doctor and sometimes mayor, would tip his hat knowingly when he saw them walking together after Sunday services. One crisp October evening, Jake invited Josephine to dinner at the hotel's small restaurant, a luxury neither of them often indulged in. He seemed unusually nervous, fidgeting with his collar and repeatedly checking his pocket. "Is something wrong?" she finally asked after he'd knocked over his water glass for the second time. "No, yes, maybe." He took a deep breath. "I'm making a mess of this." "A mess of what?" Instead of answering, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. "I've been saving since July," he said, sliding the pouch across the table to her. "It's not much, but it's honest." With trembling fingers, Josephine opened the pouch and tipped the contents into her palm. A ring gleamed in the lamplight, a simple gold band with a small pearl set in the center. "I love you, Josephine Keller," Jake said, his voice steady despite the anxiety in his eyes. "I know it hasn't been all that long, but when you know, you know. I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." Tears blurred her vision as she looked from the ring to his earnest face. "Are you sure? I have nothing to bring to a marriage. You have everything I need." He reached across the table to take her free hand. "You have courage and kindness, and a spirit that refuses to give up. What more could I ask for in a wife?" "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Jake Harrington, I will marry you." He slipped from his chair and knelt beside her, taking the ring and sliding it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. The other diners in the small restaurant broke into applause, and Josephine realized that everyone had been watching, holding their breath. She laughed through her tears as Jake kissed her, sealing their promise in front of the whole town. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church at the edge of town. Josephine wore a cream-colored dress that the women of Gila Bend had worked together to make for her, with lace collar and cuffs donated by Mrs. Abernathy from her own wedding gown. Jake stood tall in a new suit, his eyes never leaving Josephine as she walked down the short aisle to meet him. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Jake's kiss held all the promise of their future together. The town celebrated with them, turning the churchyard into a makeshift reception area. There was music from a fiddle and guitar, dancing under the stars, and enough food to feed twice their number. As twilight deepened into night, Jake led Josephine back to his cabin, now their cabin behind the livery. "Welcome home, Mrs. Harrington," he said as he carried her over the threshold. She laughed at the formality. "I've been here before, you know. Not like this." His eyes darkened with meaning. "Not as my wife." The cabin had been transformed. Fresh curtains hung at the windows, a colorful quilt adorned the bed, and wildflowers filled mason jars on every surface. "When did you do all this?" "Had some help from the ladies while we were at the church." He set her down gently. "Do you like it?" "It's perfect." And it was simple, honest, like the man who now stood watching her with such tenderness it made her heart ache. That night, as Jake introduced her to the intimacies of marriage with gentle patience, Josephine finally understood what it meant to be truly cherished. His hands and lips mapped her body with reverent wonder, drawing responses she never knew she was capable of. When they finally came together as husband and wife, the joining was more than physical. It was the completion of a circle that had begun that fateful day when he found her dying in the street. Afterward, lying in his arms as their breathing returned to normal, Josephine traced the scar on his left shoulder, the bullet wound he'd received at Shiloh. "You ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Staying out west instead of going back home after the war?" He caught her hand, bringing it to his lips. "Never, especially not now." His eyes held hers in the dim light. "What about you? Do you still wish you'd made it to California?" She shook her head, marveling at how completely her dreams had transformed in just a few months. "I was running away, not towards something. I thought California would give me a fresh start, but I found everything I needed right here." She pressed a kiss to his chest, just above his heart. "Right here with you." Life settled into a rhythm of work and love and small daily joys. Jake's livery business thrived as more settlers passed through Gila Bend. Josephine continued working at the hotel until spring, when she discovered she was carrying their first child. The pregnancy was difficult. Morning sickness plagued her well into her second trimester, and the summer heat of the Arizona Territory sapped her strength. Jake fussed over her constantly, bringing home special treats from the general store, reading to her in the evenings, and taking over many of the household chores despite his long hours at the livery. "You're going to wear yourself out," she chided one evening as he rubbed her swollen feet. "I'm fine." But the dark circles under his eyes told a different story. "Jake, I'm pregnant, not made of glass. You need to rest too." He shook his head, stubborn as always. "I promised I'd never leave your side when you needed me. I aim to keep that promise." The memory of being abandoned by the wagon train still cast occasional shadows over her happiness. Jake seemed determined to ensure she never felt that vulnerable again. Their son, William James Harrington, was born on a stormy October night in 1873. The labor was long and difficult. Doc Jenkins was called away to another emergency, leaving Mrs. Abernathy to serve as midwife. Jake refused to leave the cabin despite the older woman's protestations that men had no place in a birthing room. "I'm staying," he said firmly, holding Josephine's hand as another contraction racked her body. "I promised her I wouldn't leave." For 16 hours he stayed by her side, wiping her brow, holding her through the pain, whispering encouragement when she swore she couldn't continue. When William finally made his squalling entrance into the world, Jake's face was streaked with tears of relief and joy. "He's perfect," he whispered, cradling their son with hands that trembled slightly. "Look what we made, Josie." Mrs. Abernathy bustled around, cleaning up and preparing a light meal for the new mother. Before she left, she patted Jake's shoulder. "Never seen a man stay through the whole birthing before," she said, approval evident in her tone. "She's lucky to have you, Jake Harrington." "I'm the lucky one," he replied, never taking his eyes off his wife and newborn son. William thrived under the doting attention of his parents. By his first birthday, he was toddling around the cabin in livery, charming everyone he met with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined spirit. Jake built him a small wooden horse that became his constant companion. Life wasn't always easy. The winter of 1874 brought unusually heavy rains that flooded the livery and damaged much of their stock of feed. A band of rustlers passed through the territory that spring, stealing 3 of Jake's best horses before the marshal's posse caught up with them. Josephine developed a persistent cough that lingered for months, bringing back memories of her earlier illness. Through it all, they faced each challenge together. Jake's quiet strength and unwavering support became the bedrock of their life. Josephine's resilience and practical nature kept them moving forward when obstacles arose. They saved every penny, dreaming of buying land outside town to build a proper ranch someday. In the summer of 1875, their daughter Elizabeth Rose joined the family. Unlike her brother's difficult birth, Eliza came quickly and with relative ease. "She's impatient to see the world," Jake laughed as he held his daughter for the first time. "Gets that from her mother." "I think you mean she's headstrong," Josephine countered with a tired smile. "Like her father." The children grew rapidly, filling their small cabin with laughter and occasional tears. Jake expanded the livery, adding a small blacksmith operation that brought in additional income. Josephine started a kitchen garden that supplied them with vegetables, and became known for the preserves she sold at the general store. In 1877, their hard work and saving finally paid off. They purchased 30 acres of land 5 miles outside Gila Bend, with good water rights and enough flat ground for proper grazing. Jake built their new home himself, with help from friends in town, a sturdy 4-room ranch house with a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides. The day they moved in, 5-year-old William ran from room to room in excitement. 3-year-old Eliza toddled after her brother, trying to keep up on chubby legs. Jake carried Josephine across the threshold just as he had on their wedding night. "What do you think?" he asked, setting her down in the main room. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the simple but comfortable furnishings. Josephine turned slowly, taking in the home he had built for them. "It's everything I ever dreamed of," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And so much more." That night, after the children were asleep in their new room, Jake and Josephine sat on the porch swing, watching the stars appear in the vast desert sky. "Did you ever imagine this?" he asked, his arm around her shoulders. "That day when the wagon train left you behind." She leaned into him, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and soap that always clung to him. "Never. I thought my life was over." She looked up at him, still amazed at how much love she felt for this man who had saved her in more ways than one. "I couldn't see that it was just beginning." Jake's hand tightened on her shoulder. "Sometimes the worst moments lead us to the best ones." He kissed the top of her head. "I thank God every day that I found you, Josephine Harrington. And I thank God every day that you stayed." Their life continued to flourish on their small ranch. Jake raised and trained horses, developing a reputation for quality stock that brought buyers from as far away as Tucson. Josephine expanded her garden into a small orchard, planting peach and apple trees that somehow thrived in the harsh desert climate with careful tending. William grew into a thoughtful boy who shared his father's way with horses. By age 10, he could gentle the most skittish colt with nothing more than patience and quiet words. Eliza became her mother's shadow, learning to preserve fruits and vegetables, to sew and mend, but also developing a fierce independence that sometimes led to butting heads with her equally strong-willed mother. In 1879, Josephine gave birth to twins Samuel Thomas and Sarah Jane. The double blessing nearly overwhelmed their small home, but somehow they made room, both physically and in their hearts. "I never thought I'd have such a big family," Jake mused one night as they collapsed into bed after finally getting all 4 children to sleep. Josephine chuckled tiredly. "Are you complaining, Mr. Harrington?" "Not a bit, Mrs. Harrington." He pulled her close. "Just amazed at how full my life has become. As the children grew, so did their operation." By 1885, the Harrington Ranch covered 100 acres. They employed 2 hands to help with the horses and the small herd of cattle they'd acquired. The older children attended school in town during the week, staying with Mrs. Abernathy, who had retired from the hotel and was delighted to have young people in her home again. The hardships they faced, drought years, illness, the normal struggles of raising 4 active children, only seemed to strengthen the bond between Jake and Josephine. They weathered each storm together, finding in each other the strength to continue when obstacles arose. In the spring of 1887, 15 years after Jake had found Josephine dying in the street of Gila Bend, they stood together on their front porch watching William ride out. At 20, their eldest was heading to Prescott to apprentice with a renowned horse trainer, taking the first steps toward his own future. "Will we ever get used to watching them leave?" Josephine asked, leaning against her husband's solid frame as their son disappeared over the rise. "No." Jake's voice was gruff with emotion. "But we raised them to be strong and independent. Can't fault them for becoming what we taught them to be." She smiled up at him, noting the silver now threading through his light brown hair, the deeper lines around his eyes and mouth. The years had changed them both physically, but the love between them had only deepened with time. "Remember what you said to me that day by the spring, when you first asked to court me?" His arm tightened around her waist. "I said a lot of foolish things that day. You said I was the kind of woman a man builds a future with, someone who doesn't break when life gets hard." She turned to face him fully. "That's what you've given me, Jake, the strength to bend without breaking." "No, Josie." He cupped her face in his weathered hands. "You always had that strength. I just had the good sense to recognize it." Inside the house, Eliza was teaching the twins to play checkers, their laughter drifting out through the open windows. The afternoon sun painted the desert in shades of gold and amber. Birds called from the cottonwoods they'd planted years ago. "I love you, Jake Harrington," Josephine said softly, the words no less meaningful for having been said countless times over the years. "And I love you." He kissed her, a gentle affirmation of everything they'd built together. Always have, always will. As twilight settled over their land, they remained on the porch, hands linked, watching the first stars appear. Their journey together had begun with abandonment and illness, with one man's refusal to walk away from someone in need. It had grown into a love that sustained them through hardship and joy alike, a partnership that had built not just a ranch, but a legacy. The Arizona Territory would soon become a state. Their children would grow up, marry, have families of their own. The world around them would continue to change and evolve. But some things remained constant: the desert skies, the rhythm of seasons, and the unbreakable bond between two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed, exactly when they needed it most. No regrets. Jake asked softly as the last light faded from the western horizon. Josephine squeezed his hand. Not a single one. In the years that followed, the Harrington family continued to flourish. William returned from Prescott with a bride, a schoolteacher named Margaret, who won over the entire family with her quick wit and kind heart. They built a small house on the eastern edge of the ranch, where William took over more of the horse training business from his father. Eliza shocked everyone by announcing her intention to attend nursing school in Phoenix. "Doc Jenkins is getting old," she explained to her parents. "Gila Bend will need someone with medical training." Jake and Josephine supported her decision, though it meant months with their daughter away from home. The twins, Sam and Sarah, grew into teenagers who balanced each other perfectly. Sam quiet and thoughtful like his older brother. Sarah spirited and adventurous like Eliza. They brought both joy and worry to their parents as they navigated the transition from childhood to young adulthood. In 1896, William and Margaret welcomed a son, making Jake and Josephine grandparents at the relatively young age of 52 and 46. Holding little Jacob in her arms, Josephine marveled at how life had come full circle. "Remember how terrified you were when William was born?" She teased Jake as he hovered anxiously, waiting for his turn to hold his grandson. "I wasn't terrified," he protested. "Just concerned." "You were white as a sheet and shaking like a leaf." She carefully transferred the sleeping infant to his arms. "Much like you are now." Jake's expression softened as he cradled the tiny boy. "Hard to believe we were ever this young." He looked up at Josephine, his blue eyes still capable of making her heart skip after all these years. "Or that we've come so far from where we started." That evening, they sat on their porch swing as they had nearly every night for 20 years, watching the sunset paint the desert in fiery hues. The ranch spread before them, horses grazing in the paddocks, fruit trees heavy with spring blossoms, the new windmill pumping water into the irrigation ditches Jake had designed. "You know," Josephine said thoughtfully, "if that wagon train hadn't left me behind, none of this would exist." Jake considered this. "Do you ever wonder what happened to those people, the ones who abandoned you?" "I used to. For years, I imagined them reaching California and failing miserably." She chuckled at her former vindictiveness. "Now I just hope they found something half as good as what I found here." He squeezed her hand. "Doubt that's possible." As they entered their third decade together, life brought new joys and challenges. Eliza returned from nursing school and set up practice in town, eventually marrying the son of the general store owner. The twins both chose to stay close to home, Sam taking over management of the cattle operation, Sarah discovering a talent for breeding and raising champion quarter horses. In 1901, Jake suffered a fall while breaking a particularly stubborn stallion. The injury left him with a permanent limp and forced him to reduce his role in the daily operations of the ranch. For the first time, Josephine saw her strong husband struggle with feelings of uselessness. "I'm becoming a burden," he said one night after a day when pain had kept him confined to the house. Never. She sat beside him, taking his hand in hers. Jake Harrington, you've carried this family for nearly 30 years. Let us carry you for a change. Gradually, he found new ways to contribute, keeping the books for their growing enterprise, designing improvements to the ranch buildings, and most importantly, becoming the grandfather who always had time for a story or a riding lesson. By 1907, the Harrington Ranch was one of the most successful operations in southern Arizona. William and Sam had expanded into breeding stock, with bloodlines sought after throughout the Southwest. The family weathered economic downturns that ruined many of their neighbors, their diversified approach to ranching proving more resilient than most. That December, they gathered for Christmas 4 generations of Harringtons, filling the ranch house with laughter and love. Jake, now 63, sat by the fire with his youngest great-granddaughter on his knee, telling her the story of how he'd found her great-grandmother alone and sick on the streets of Gila Bend. "And did you fall in love right away?" 5-year-old Lucy asked, wide-eyed. Jake caught Josephine's eye across the room. "Not right away," he answered honestly, "but once I did, it was forever." Later that night, after the younger generations had returned to their own homes on various parts of the ranch, Jake and Josephine lay in the bedroom they'd shared for 3 decades. "You embellish that story more every time you tell it," she said, nestling against his side. "Just making it more interesting for the young ones." His fingers traced idle patterns on her shoulder. "The truth is plenty dramatic without my additions." "The truth," she mused, "the truth is that you saved my life, Jake Harrington. Not just by nursing me back to health, but by showing me what it means to be truly loved." He turned to face her, his eyes serious in the dim lamplight. "And you saved mine, Josie. I was just existing before you came along. You gave me a reason for living." As they drifted to sleep in each other's arms, Josephine reflected on the journey they'd shared. From that desperate day when she'd watched the wagon train disappear, leaving her to what she thought was certain death, to this moment of contentment surrounded by the family they'd created together. Life had not always been easy. There had been droughts and floods, illnesses and injuries, disagreements and reconciliations. But through it all, Jake had kept the promise he made that first day he had never left her side when she needed him. And she had kept a promise of her own, one she'd made silently the day he'd asked her to marry him, to love this good, steadfast man with everything she had, for as long as she lived. Together, they had built something neither could have imagined alone, not just a successful ranch, but a legacy of love that would continue long after they were gone, carried forward in the lives of their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. As sleep claimed her, Josephine's last conscious thought was one of profound gratitude for the wagon train that had abandoned her, for the illness that had seemed like the end of her dreams, and most of all, for the cowboy who had found her when she was lost and stayed beside her ever since. In the end, being left behind had led her exactly where she was meant to be all along.